I'm going to explain a little bit more about the personality of each colour as we move through the spectrum. I'm going to explain a little bit about the wavelength and what it actually does when you paint it in a room. And the first colour I'm going to talk about is red. Red has the longest wavelength, and wavelengths are wavelengths of light. A little bit like sound, that long wavelength sounds like a beating drum. It's the most dynamic colour in the spectrum. It's the one that demands the most attention. And it's also the most advancing colour. So when we paint it in a room, the walls feel as though they're coming towards us. So it creates a really dynamic, dramatic, intense and sensuous interior. We associate it with some very positive things, but also some very negative things, but it cannot be ignored. Now on the positive end, if you put a red dress on, red lipstick, red shoes, a red tie, a red jacket, you demand attention. When you walk in the room, everybody looks at you and everybody falls in love. But when you put red into a situation, say for a road sign, it warns us of danger. It reminds us of blood and fire. So it has positive and negative connotations, but it always demands attention. And in a room, it is possibly the most over-decorated colour. So when we decorate the walls with red, we tend to get tired of it much more quickly than we will other colours because it overstimulates. One of the most famous colours in decorating is called eating room red, and it was painted into dining rooms to stimulate the atmosphere, to get people talking, to make the food taste better. So red is a hugely powerful colour. It advances, so it makes an intimate interior, but it has to be used sparingly. Now we move from red to orange. Now in terms of wavelength of light, orange is slightly shorter. It's got a beautiful shape to it. If it were a sound, it would be like a bongo drum rather than the beating drum of red. It's got a joyfulness to it. It's a colour that's still advancing, but rather than overwhelming, it visually hugs us. It's a colour that we absolutely love in the Northern Hemisphere. It makes the weak, watery, cool light in the Northern Hemisphere really warm, and we love it in our homes. We love terracottas, we love peach, we love magnolia, which is an orange, a very, very pale orange. It's also our colour of the year this year. We associate orange with home. We associate orange with emotional intelligence, and it is the ultimate visual hug in the spectrum. Now moving from orange to yellow. Now the wavelength is starting to oscillate a little bit more. I imagine if yellow were a sound, it would be like an enormous bumblebee trapped in a jam jar. It's got an intense energy to it. When we see yellow, we're reminded of the sunshine. It brings the sunshine indoors. It's an advancing colour, but it doesn't overwhelm. The first colour we see as human beings is yellow, and we associate it with youth. We associate it with positivity and energy, daffodils in the garden, baby chicks. It's a colour that just breathes life and sunshine into a room. It's also a very complex colour. When you paint it on the walls almost oscillate. So a room can appear bigger and smaller at the same time. It sort of visually trips us up. The human eye can see more yellows than any other colour in the spectrum, and this is possibly why the room oscillates. So it's a very, very clever colour. It can be a colour that can be used to expand a space, but also a colour to create a space that's a little bit more intimate. So you can use yellow in different tones. Paler tones to make a room bigger and full of light, and deeper tones like mustard yellow to create this gorgeous intimate atmosphere. Now we move from yellow to green. Now green is right in the middle of the spectrum. It's oscillating a little bit more, but if it were a sound, I would imagine it sounds like water gently lapping against the shore. It's a colour that we associate with tranquility, pastoral tranquility. So when we look at green, we think of green fields, of growing things. We think of nature and the outdoors. And so it makes the walls disappear. It allows a room to really breathe. Greens at the yellow end of the scale, so lime greens, give a freshness to a room. When they're combined with white, they look amazing. So they really bring sunshine in, and really the idea of new shoots and new growth, a fantastic colour that's loved by younger people. And when you get to the deeper end of the greens towards teal, that's when green really grows up. It's got an expansive quality to it, so it's what we call a receding colour, so it makes the walls appear bigger, but it also has a grown-up nature as it gets towards the teals. Green is one of my favourite colours. It works with everything. So if you're struggling for a colour to add to a scheme, then green is the one for you. Now from green to blue, which is the world's favourite colour. The wavelength is now a little bit bigger. It's moving towards red. It's moving round the spectrum. If it were a sound, I reckon it would sound like a Harley Davidson. It's got a really lovely deep sound to it. And it's a gorgeous colour to live with. We love blue because it reminds us of the sky. And again, it's another colour that's receding. So it makes a small space feel less hemmed in. We also use blue to clear the mind, almost to clear the visual palette. It helps us think more clearly. It helps us be more creative. And so blue, although it's referred to as a cool colour, can actually warm up a room. So if you use aqua blues towards the aqua end of the blue scale, that's towards the greens, that's what we would refer to as a warm blue. It reminds us of warm skies, sunny days, warm blue seas. And then if you move towards the cooler end of blues, towards the violet scale of blues, you get a different feel, a different personality. It's much more masculine, much more moody. And so you can use blues to heat up or cool down a room to get a completely different personality. And so we move from blue to violet. Violet, in terms of wavelength, is really, really busy. If it were a sound, I reckon it would be like a really busy lawnmower. It's a colour that we associate with creative problem solving, and it's a colour that conjures up a dreamlike state in a home. So it's a colour that we love to use in bedrooms. We love to use deep aubergines combined with gold. It's also a colour that we associate possibly with vampires and teenage girls. Teenage girls migrate from being pink little girls into this sort of fury and energy of teenagehood, of teenage girls that manifests itself in purple. It's a super complex colour, and it's a colour that girls come back to later on in life. So they sort of leave it behind and then they come back to it in a much more mature form, maybe in the greyed off colours later on. It's associated with femininity, but it's also loved by blokes. So the richer, more intense, dark purples are actually loved by men. In the softer, more pastel end of the spectrum, it's beautiful for opening up a space because it's a receding colour, but in those sweeter end of the spectrum where it's towards the reds, it creates a beautiful freshness in a room, a femininity and freshness. And then in the really deep gutsy purples, you can create a completely different feel of a room, a fantastic boudoir effect. So purple's a colour that you really have to explore. It's complex, it's interesting, and it can really give you a bit of an edge over the other colours. Now, we can't talk about the spectrum without talking about neutrals. Neutrals are hugely important. Most people are confident with neutrals, so they start their decorating scheme with a neutral palette on the walls, and then they add pops of colour in the furnishings and furniture. And that's where everybody's safety zone is. Designers love to use colour because they have confidence, but neutrals is a great place to start. And we categorise neutrals as warm and cool. Warm neutrals have tones of pink, orange and yellow in them, and cool neutrals have tones of blue, green and violet. And those warm and cool colours really give a character to stone colours that just work with everything. So neutral colours, don't ignore them. They're not boring, they're very exciting, and they can be the building blocks of fantastic colour schemes. All interior designers love white. But which white to choose? There are so many, there are hundreds and hundreds. And so we've categorised whites that work with specific materials. And here we've got a collection of whites that work with dark wood and timber, whites that work with powder-coated fittings, which architects absolutely love, whites that work with cream, brick and stone, whites that work with iron and metal, cooling whites. So you might have a building that's in full sunshine and you want to cool the atmosphere down. And so cooling whites are the cooler neutrals with the addition of green, violet and blue, little tiny hints that really cool the atmosphere down. And then warming whites for a north-facing room or a north-facing building where you want the atmosphere to be more welcoming and cosy. And those warming whites contain pink, orange and little tiny bits of red.